today to introduce you to our partners at Dentons. Today we're going to be talking about really one of the hottest topics in an area I'm responsible for is AI governance, and working through the frameworks such as NIST and ISO 42001. So I'm really excited to learn here. We have Peter Stockberger, who's the San Diego managing partner and part of the Venture Technology and Emerging Growth Companies group. And he also co-leads the firm's autonomous vehicle practice, which means he knows a lot about AI governance, because if you don't, we shouldn't be letting cars drive themselves around. He does have a focus on data privacy and security. I can say that anytime I hear Peter or Andrew speak, I learn something, and they offer really great solution practical advice. So we also have Andrew Clearwater, also a partner at Dentons, and he's in the privacy and cybersecurity team. AI, data privacy, cybersecurity, it all goes hand in hand. So I'm sure many of us that have this in our responsibilities touch on them all. And he has deep experience in implementing technology responsibly, and again, deep technical capabilities with what I have seen and practical solutions. He also has in-house background, which I think is helpful, right? We all like that. Oh, you've been in the trenches, you know how difficult it is to get to the business to think about these things. So I am excited, and I will turn it over to them because we have a lot to learn.
Great. Thanks very much, Alexa. And thanks everybody for joining us for what we hope will be a thought-provoking discussion on what Alexa mentioned is this emerging area of taking your AI governance framework and approach and starting to benchmark it to core standards to expand your market share and to ensure that you're set up responsibly as you move forward. So Andrew and I are both in the data privacy group, and I lead our US AI advisory team, which Andrew is also part of. Andrew's out in Portland, Maine, and I'm based in San Diego. And we are going to walk you through today our view of how to benchmark your AI governance program in today's environment. So we're going to start with a discussion of really where AI is advanced at the enterprise level, which I think is an important level setting before getting into the benchmarking discussion. We're going to look at the emerging global legal and risk landscape that we're all facing, why AI governance is important now, and ultimately what these standards look like, both from a NIST AI risk management framework as well as ISO 42001. I will say before we get started, if you do have any questions throughout, go ahead and populate them in the chat function, and Andrew and I will answer them live as we go through to make this as interactive as possible. So I think to kick things off, to understand where we are from a technology perspective, it's important to understand what AI is and where it's been, where it is today, and importantly, where it's heading. And I think this will give you a sense of why governance is so important to build now, so you're set up to be able to scale for the future. AI is not a new technology, and Andrew and I debated on, do we do the traditional lawyer slide of what is AI, and here's what generative AI is. But I think we're all fairly advanced at this point that we don't need to do that sort of rudimentary discussion. But AI as a technology is a big umbrella term. And when you look at, for example, California's definition of artificial intelligence in a new law that took effect in January of this year, it's essentially any technology that varies in its level of autonomy, that for a set of goals or tasks can generate output based on input that can influence a physical or virtual environment. That broad definition you see across regulatory landscapes, whether it be state law, federal law, or even international law. And so that broad umbrella of technology has been morphing over the years into different forms of artificial intelligence. For years, for decades, we had what were called deterministic rules. And that's basically like your spam filter in your email that says, if these words are present, then you move it into the spam filter. And that sort of traditional AI is all around us every day. We then, in the recent past, moved into what's known as machine learning and deep learning, which is a field of machine learning. And that is looking for patterns in large data sets. So your Netflix recommendation engine is a form of machine learning. Westlaw is a form of machine learning. It's looking for patterns in data. It's out of that machine learning field that we had in 2022 the release of ChatGPT as a form of generative AI. Generative AI is a machine learning tool that's built on a very unique architecture called the transformer architecture that is looking for numerical values in data sets to then bring back what is likely the next word or sentence or pixel in an image or sound wave in a piece of audio. And so it's generating new synthetic content based on patterns it's recognized in its training data set. So that's from the 1950s to 2022. But what's important for all of us to understand is from 2022, with the release of a very simplistic chatbot called ChatGPT, to 2025, when we're talking about multi-agentic systems using complicated communication protocols called the MCP protocol released by Anthropic to take over your computer, to perform tasks, to access multiple tools, we really see a tremendous acceleration in the technology. And Andrew, I know before coming over to Dentons, you were in-house running an AI governance program and at a company where you were releasing products and services to companies. And so I think you probably saw firsthand this incredible trajectory, even just in the past 3 years, where AI is headed.
Yeah, I mean, I worked as the lead of the AI governance program at a company that was building AI governance software. So it's sort of the turducken of governance issues there. But indeed, I mean, one of the things that we saw was, an inventory of issues that was growing incredibly quickly, and as we'll see soon enough, it involves a whole host of individuals with different skills that are needed to solve the problem. And so one of the things that you'll find is there's a broad range of AI that you're dealing with and tracking across a life cycle, but you're also using a broad range of skills in order to address that technology, which is part of the reason that speed becomes such a difficult factor in governing this.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing today, Andrew, is generative AI is dominating the conversation. Generative AI is powering most of the tools on the market. It's what folks think of when they think of AI, but it isn't the only form of AI in the marketplace. And there's a lot of money and energy right now in the AI labs in building the next generation of AI that goes beyond generative AI and machine learning. Machine learning is data dependent, it's energy dependent, it makes mistakes, it doesn't understand context, it doesn't understand the physical world. It just translates letters and pixels into ones and zeros and looks for patterns. So it's always going to make mistakes. There are folks working on developing what are known as active inference AI or embodied AI, which would understand the physical world and can make predictions about how the physical world interacts. And so this is where we're going to see emergence in AI and robotics. So AI is on this significant trajectory, and it wouldn't be a good AI discussion without highlighting Gartner's AI hype cycle chart from last year. They are working on releasing their 2025 chart. But this gives you a sense of where we are in the AI trajectory. Generative AI is a blip on the radar in terms of what is coming. Now, for those not familiar with this Gartner chart, on the left side is when the innovation is triggered. And so there's a lot of expectation, and you reach a peak of inflated expectations, and then you hit a trough of disillusionment. It doesn't work that well, and then into a plateau of productivity. Gartner sees generative AI on the downswing because of all of those inherent limitations on it's reliant on training data. It doesn't understand the physical world. So it's difficult to scale generative AI within companies in a way that truly drives return on investment, because when you need precision and trust and reliability, generative AI can fall flat in a lot of use cases. We see on the left side, though, things like multi-agent systems, neurosymbolic AI, which is mapping AI to how the brain works, composite AI, which are combined machine learning, deep learning, and other forms of AI. Those are still coming online, but we're going to see, I think, a more complicated framework in the future. But to go from where the technology is, I wanted to highlight, and Andrew, I know you've been seeing a lot of this, especially in your in-house role. What are the trends we're seeing in enterprise adoption? And I think we really see three trends going on. The first one is general purpose use, or that's at least what we're referring to it as. And these are general applications like Microsoft Copilot, ChatGPT, Google Gemini, even DeepSeek for those who have been brave enough to test it out on their computers. These are general purpose tools that folks are using to enhance their productivity. They're using it every day on their phones, on their tablets, on their laptops to draft emails, to come up with ideas, to respond to folks' inquiries, to prepare presentations. Microsoft released a report last year with LinkedIn where they showed across 31 countries, 75% of employees are using AI and 90% think it makes it more efficient. This is across generations, and over 80% are saying they're not reporting it to their employers because they feel like it could be viewed as cheating or unfair. So there's a gap between employer AI literacy programs and education and use. But what we're seeing is that it's increasing. A recent RAMP AI index shows that 32.4% of all US businesses are now paying for OpenAI subscriptions. These are the pro models that are charging $20 a month or $200 a month to get access to deep research and other features. We're also seeing a big emergence in what folks are calling vibe coding, and that's using coding tools like Windsurf and Cursor to generate code to create a video game or to create a website with no coding experience. So they call it vibe coding because you're creating code for a website, but you really don't know if the code's right or wrong. So you're just going with a vibe. It looks right, so the code must be right, which introduces a whole host of problems. But Andrew, I think if you could share some insights that you saw, I mean, this general purpose use, I think we see it being used across companies, and it's got some traditional challenges, right? Confidentiality, privacy, security, which I think acceptable use guidelines can really help with. But what are some of the challenges that you've been seeing?
Well, I think the other piece that's somewhat hidden until you pick up a tool, like you could use Copilot as an example, is there's a hidden data governance issue that arises when you start using these tools, or hopefully before, where you realize that data quality matters a lot to successful use of these tools. You can create compromises, you can create poor answers, and the data quality and the related issue, which is whether you have sufficient talent within your organization to roll out these systems, both of those can be significant hurdles for companies. Within 2025, US companies, 40% of them said that they plan to hire AI-related roles. And so we know that it's not just getting access to the technology that gives you the benefit, but there's a need for preparation as well as skill in order to roll these things out. There's also a big drop-off between the testing that goes on with these tools and the move to production. Nearly 2/3 of the tested use cases don't make them into production contexts, which I guess is good. I mean, it does show that companies are being critical of the use and making sure that it is successful when deployed, but it also goes to show you that maybe your initial impressions of how applicable this is to your problems are not being met on first test. There's another trend that I have observed, which is trying to shift towards high value strategic use cases. Obviously, we have the general application being talked about here, but to emphasize the reason you're getting these tools to be something bigger and more impactful so that you can get the budget and so you can align the resources appropriately.
Yeah, and I think that deeper strategic use, Andrew, that you're talking about is what Gartner calls decision intelligence.
Yes.
This is a more embedded use of AI, more complicated generally in terms of how it's being set up. It's not the general purpose use, but perhaps it's machine learning plus large language models plus another form of deep learning combined to drive decision intelligence. And so Gartner actually predicts by 2026 that 75% of the global 500 are going to be using some form of decision intelligence. So this is, I guess, we would put this in the bucket of a more advanced form of AI. And building a governance program that can scale to go from the general purpose use and regulate the risks and guardrails there to the deeper decision intelligence, I think, is the secret sauce for ROI in using AI. Some of the use cases that we're seeing, and Gartner highlights as well, is data insights, marketing and advertising. There's a big push to use AI to drive more personalized ads. In the manufacturing space, we're seeing it used in digital twin and recreation and sort of finding efficiencies in the supply chain. We're seeing it with robotic surgery, in hospitals, claims handling with insurance companies, grid automation for energy companies. So you can see this sort of broad category of deep decision intelligence, I think, is where we're seeing most of the value. And I think, Andrew, that gap that you talked about between the pilot and the production, it's because people are running into, well, does this really work? Or is this too high risk? Or is it reliable enough to deploy in the market?
Yeah, we have broad general adoption and narrow high value adoption. And it's interesting because when you see the kind of the overall trends that talk about, we're adopting AI faster than we adopted computers or the internet, that's measurable and that's true, but it's sort of like if we adopted the internet only to use email, right? Like you're missing out on a lot. And so these early use cases are just not really getting us to where we're going to be going just within a year or two from now. And I think part of our discussion is really to make sure that people are aware of what's next with some of these comments so that we are designing the programs that we're going to need very soon.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Andrew, because one of the challenges I hear from companies in building out an AI governance program is we're still very early stage. I think we've got what we need in terms of an AI policy. We've got a acceptable use policy, and we're training folks on AI, but we don't quite need the Cadillac version of governance. And I think our message to you today is the technology now is on a trajectory of innovation to where that may be true for you today, but in 6 to 12 months, the technology is going to be available and be advanced to where you'll need a scalable governance program. And that's why benchmarking to NIST and ISO today is so important. I think one of those advancements, Andrew, that you're talking about is in the area of agentic AI. So unless you've been living under a rock in the AI space, you've heard everybody refer to agentic AI and agents are being used to describe everything, some which aren't really agentic. But what agentic AI is in a nutshell is it's using AI not just to generate an output. So think of ChatGPT, it's sort of a static environment. It's waiting for you to give it an input. Write me a bedtime story for my 6-year-old. And then it's going to its training data, it's coming up with an answer, and it's giving me an output. And it's up to me on how I'm going to use that. And I can iterate on that output. I can give it further instructions, but it's a very sort of simple back and forth. Agentic AI is where you give the AI a goal or a task to complete. And it accesses tools. So think the internet, email, databases, or it can communicate with other AI agents to perform and complete a task. So a common example is a travel AI agent. So you would access an AI agent and you would say, I need to book a flight from San Diego to New York City. Here are the dates. I like to sit in an aisle seat, and I need a hotel near this location. That agent would then access your Outlook calendar, a tool. It would validate your availability, validate the meeting time. It would then potentially access and communicate with the agent that's being offered by Southwest Airlines or American Airlines, communicate with that agent to find availability, potentially book your ticket through that agent-to-agent flow, and also communicate with the agent being offered by the hotel. All in one seamless, very quick interaction, coming back with you with a book ticket for your review and approval. That's sort of a very simplistic overview of what agentic AI is. Now, there are very complicated agentic workflows being discussed. And Gartner predicts by 2028, 33% of all software inside of an enterprise will have some component of agentic AI going out and performing autonomous, independent tasks. We see Salesforce that released Agentforce, which allows you to build these agentic solutions inside of Salesforce. Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic, they're all releasing agents and platforms for you to build agents on to then communicate. Some common use cases are customer service. So Salesforce has a thing called the Einstein chat agent, where you imagine you're chatting with a retailer about returning a product, and they say, no problem. Would you like this replacement? I'll arrange a replacement. Let me access the database. I'll process the return. We'll ship the product, all using an agent. It's not a human being, and it's accessing databases and completing tasks. Another one are voice agents. So calling somewhere and you're interacting with an AI who can access databases, communicate with others, and complete the task. So applications are being built by the tens of thousands right now in the agentic space. So there's a lot of energy in this area of AI. And Andrew, I know you and I have talked a lot about this sort of behind the scenes. And as lawyers, I'm sure everybody on this webinar is thinking, well, this sounds like a nightmare to have these autonomous robots running around making decisions. But that's the promise of it, is to remove the human from the loop, which is counterintuitive to everything we've been talking about around AI governance. I mean, Andrew, you could probably speak to this because I know you've worked with NIST on the NIST risk management framework and with some other standards organizations. Human in the loop is one of the anchor principles to saying that you're engaged in responsible AI governance.
Yeah.
And
when you spoke to the uses of these agents, I think most of us assume like this is tedious tasks at scale, right? Things that we can understand and supervise easily, but we should also understand that some of these tasks are actually beyond the skill of the people that, would be supervising, right? Specialized coding that's beyond the skill of the coder is capable with these tools, and therefore really some of the human oversight starts to become meaningless even before it becomes agentic.
That's right. And one of the big liability issues is who is responsible for what the agent says or what the agent does. And will the liability regimes be shifted? This is something that we've been talking about for years in the autonomous vehicle space, which is when there's an accident on the road with a fully driverless vehicle, who is responsible for that accident? Is it the car manufacturer? Is it the software engineer who built the program that didn't take into account that traffic scenario? Or is it somewhere in between? Yeah, Alexa.
So I think this is something, I'm struggling with, or us as an organization, is everyone wants to value add, to say we're doing agentic, we're moving efficiencies. And then we're also trying to say, but there's a human component. Do we have much guidance of like how much of that human oversight is there? Is it really just around the final decision that there's like, well, I put eyes on it, it looked okay to me? Or what, like, where is that tension sort of landing on how much human intervention and oversight then says, oh yeah, you're in the good area?
Yeah, so I would say we're starting to see more literature and analysis around the role that humans play in orchestrating either 2 agents or an army of 100 or 1,000 agents operating in an enterprise. And an example of this are some communication protocols that have recently been released. So Google recently released what's called the agent-to-agent protocol, and Anthropic recently released what's called the Model Context Protocol. So A2A for Google and MCP for Anthropic. What the A2A protocol is Google released an open protocol. It's code that you can program to your AI agent that allows it to communicate with other agents in a sort of seamless communication protocol context. So think HTTP for the internet. Websites speak to each other in a standard protocol, HTTP, and they communicate through HTML language so we can all interact on the web seamlessly. So the A2A protocol is there for agents to communicate. The MCP protocol is there from Anthropic to allow agents to access tools like email, the web, and other tools. So Alexa, to your point, you've got now, let's say, an agent built with the A2A protocol and the MCP protocol. Where does the human being come in with the governance oversight? Well, there are some real security concerns with these protocols, and they're at the model layer. So there still needs to be a human being reviewing what's the underlying model being deployed here and what are the risks there. You have issues at the data layer. What are the issues relating to the data being exchanged? And now you have issues at the protocol layer. what type of information and permissions are the agents giving to each other through the A2A protocol? They almost present each other with ID cards that exchange information. Who's controlling what information is being exchanged? So we're starting to see where human beings are needing to get into more granular detail on the deployment of agents at the model layer, the data layer, the protocol layer, and increasingly what's being called the orchestration layer. So for example, OpenAI released something called Swarm, which they're advertising as a platform where you can orchestrate all your agents at once. So a human being would be running these orchestration platforms and giving guidance to the agents. So it's a bit like supervising in the law firm context, a very junior attorney, and giving instructions and who's going to be responsible for their activities at the orchestration layer. This is something, Andrew, you and I have talked about a lot, which is, and Alexa, you have seen this internally as well. When you're building an AI governance program, early on, or even in the last year, a lot of folks in the privacy or the legal role were tasked, you're going to run our governance program. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, we're seeing companies bring on somebody or appoint somebody to be an AI officer, to be able to oversee all of these complicated integrations, orchestrations, communicating between the C-suite, the board, and then the operations team at legal, privacy, and cyber. Because I think as agentic AI becomes more sophisticated, it's no longer going to be feasible to ask the legal department to oversee its operation. It's going to be too much. It already is getting to be too much. So I think that's one issue. And then accuracy and reliability, there is a role for us humans to play a role in interrogating how accurate and reliable agentic AI systems are, because what model are they relying on? If it's still all generative AI, which today's agentic systems are still generative AI, they're still powered by large language models. Those have problems. They have, Andrew, what does NIST call it? Confabulations. Some people say hallucinations.
Oh, instead of hallucinations or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I like confabulations more. It sounds
Yeah.
fancier, but
yeah,
they still get things wrong because it's a statistical amplifier. It's not truth. It doesn't understand what a table is. So it's always going to get something wrong. Well, if you have an orchestration of 1,000 agents and 5 of them got something wrong, and now you have incorrectness now in the system being propagated, you can see where some of those challenges lie. Alexa, I think one piece of information that will arm you in terms of saying us humans are still important, which I feel like we're in a Dark Mirror episode, just advocating for our humanness and why it's important. But this Gartner slide, I think, is really important, because what Gartner is telling people is when you hear the word agent, it really has 2 components. It has an autonomy component, which is it can perform things on its own. And then there's an agency component, which is, does it have the authority and the judgment to do things on its own? And on an agency scale, deterministic chatbots, which is really what we're all used to, very low agency, because it can do things, but it needs to be highly supervised. The current LLM-based agentic systems are not that much better on the agency scale, because it doesn't understand the world, versus human beings that have the highest agency. So Gartner is saying, when you're deploying agentic systems, mind the agency gap. And this is where I think human oversight and governance and building good governance programs really comes into play. So with that sort of setting the table on where the technology is and some of the challenges, Andrew and I just wanted to touch base on where the legal landscape is around AI, and then how an either NIST anchored or an ISO anchored program really comes into play. And Andrew, I know as you were in-house building the AI governance program, you saw this kind of global legal landscape rising, and because you guys were building an AI governance program in itself.
That's right.
But in my view, we really see these buckets breaking down, and maybe you could speak to some of these sort of big bucket trends that you were seeing at the global level.
Yeah, I think I would use similar buckets to the ones described here. But when you look to the European Union, broad horizontal regulation, risk tiered, at least planned, strong enforcement, but risk-based and centralized, essentially. When you look to the US, we're more in a decentralized sectoral approach, fragmented, sector-specific, innovation-driven, often voluntary. It's interesting, the trend of, a couple years ago to today is that we're actually more focused on innovation in the last, several months to a year than we were at the beginning. And so there is some pressure to back off even the risk-based approach. But to finish sort of the kind of looking European Union, US, China's a bit different. It's more on this sort of state-driven, centralized approach, so top-down, government-led, but rapid and focused on security and controls. And then you have something that shifts a little bit when you look to the UK, Singapore, Japan. You get something that's more principle-based, pro-innovation as well, but it's flexible, regulator-guided, emphasizes ethical principles. And then there's sort of another category of sorts where, Brazil, UAE, South Korea, there's more of a mix of the above models. It's still inspired by, I think, some of the other models, EU and US combo maybe, but still takes into account, local considerations that make it unique enough that you can't say that they're participating fully in those other models. And if that's, 5 total that I've just said, it makes it quite difficult to say, let's make a global program that's going to be interoperable. I mean, we do know that a lot of them will point back to something like OECD principles or some kind of baseline compatibility. But this is also why our presentation points to NIST and ISO as being a great solution to make everything in these requirements map up to something above that can be more robust and allow you to move forward without having to pay attention to every little change below.
Yeah, and I think that uncertainty, Andrew, dovetails into what's happening at the federal level in the US.
That's right.
Under President Biden, we had an AI executive order that was signed in October of 2023 that directed federal agencies to deploy AI responsibly and was being used as a benchmark for a lot of private regulatory development. President Trump came in, withdrew that executive order, signed one of his own, basically saying innovation is the call of the day, beating China is the call of the day. He appointed a new AI czar, which is the former chief operating officer at PayPal, David Sachs, who is working on a federal AI policy. They just recently closed public comments on that. Thousands of comments came in, very interesting array of comments. Some of the big tech companies were calling for limiting IP law restrictions on training data. So we'll see where the federal policy lands. We've also got some rules at the federal level about export controls in the mix. The Biden executive order restricted the export of hardware chips as well as model weights to certain countries. The Trump administration, as of last week, indicated that they are going to withdraw that and sort of go back to the drawing board on export controls. From a regulatory standpoint at the federal level, very mixed view right now. We don't quite know where the FTC is going to land with regard to their enforcement priorities. We don't know whether the EEOC is going to continue with their AI guidance that was issued under the Biden administration. HHS is another question mark, how they're going to regulate the healthcare sector. Interestingly, we just saw a dust up with the Copyright Office that released a report that seemingly sided with some of the content creators out there about saying and casting doubt on some of the fair use arguments going on in federal court. And the head of that Copyright Office has since been dismissed since that report was released. So still quite unclear. One really interesting development, Andrew, that we were just chatting about before the webinar started is at the federal legislative level. And Andrew, maybe you can sort of tee this up, but it's a new proposal around AI regulation that is being introduced in the big, beautiful tax bill that is currently being negotiated at the House level.
Yeah, this was quite surprising. It's been covered in the Washington Post today, and was sort of available yesterday for review. But the idea is that within this budget proposal, there's an idea of federal preemption for a period of 10 years, which is it's a good amount of time, that's saying that the states in particular should be prohibited from having AI governance laws that are enforceable. And, I don't know that we think that that will work out. It's really just at the beginning stages of understanding, is this being proposed and then it'll fall apart? Is it capable from a legal point of view to be carried out? But certainly signals an intent, and it certainly is an extension of your earlier point, which is that the push to treat AI as sort of almost like an innovation arms race, so to speak, has caused a pullback in many areas of pre-existing restrictions.
Yeah, I think this proposal to preempt state law is very interesting because at the state level is where we see most of the regulatory and legal frameworks applying. And so let's take this idea that the federal law is going to preempt state AI law. I think that's very complicated because what we have going on at the state level is we have AI specific laws that are being proposed and being passed. This year alone, this legislative session, we have 45 states with over 550 proposals pending on AI specific laws. Now, in effect right now, we have the Colorado AI Act that takes effect in February that regulates high-risk use cases of AI for both deployers and developers. Interestingly, Andrew, on that federal preemption point, it was reported today by Bloomberg that Colorado's governor is supportive of the federal preemption because he now has changed his mind on this AI Act in Colorado. And so we'll see how that plays out. But on the flip side, California's Privacy Protection Agency's executive director came out yesterday and said, we're against preemption because we want to be able to regulate AI. So we've got laws in Colorado, Utah, California has proposed automated decision-making technology regulations. We have 18 new AI laws that took effect this year. So we've got AI-specific laws. They're really starting to fall down on regulating industries like healthcare, delivery of medicine, insurance, or they're regulating high-risk use cases like employment decision-making, financial decision-making, housing. We're starting to see this theme of innovation to dominate. So states kind of wanting to dial back a little bit, this focus, but AI-specific laws. We then have this other bucket, which are existing legal frameworks that the attorneys general in California and Oregon and Massachusetts have said, we don't need a new AI law in order to hold companies accountable for misuse, deceptive use, negligent use of AI. So Andrew, what I don't understand about the preemption is, does that preempt existing legal enforcement under the unfair business practice laws? Is it only relating to laws that govern models? Is it relating to employment regulation? Very unclear.
Yeah.
And I think the other piece that's unclear is the litigation landscape, which I think we're seeing a rising tide of lawsuits around employment discrimination, consumer protection, privacy-related lawsuits under SIPA, relating to the use of third-party tools, copyright litigation. So this preemption, it's a good headline, but this state patchwork, I think, really drives home why preemption is a challenge, but also why building a governance program is becoming a challenge.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, to even speak to the overlap of privacy, when we talk about California, we're talking about a law that began speaking about privacy and is currently, we're debating the merits of how it affects AI. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why, the issue of, do you need an AI governance program is a question that 2 years ago was being debated, I think is no longer a debate. If you are going to be developing or deploying AI on any level, whether it's letting general purpose use proliferate, or you're developing deeper intelligence, or you're on this agentic path, you need a governance program in place. But what is AI governance, and why do you need a specific governance framework for AI tools? And I think it really is now a business necessity to have a governance framework in place. Most folks have built a governance program, to measure against certain ethical principles. So on the right-hand side of the screen is an example. It's just a consolidation of a lot of the ethical principles that we see at the OECD level or NIST or the EU AI Act. And these are principles that you should be following to ensure that your development or deployment of AI is responsible or trustworthy. But that's easier said than done. And I think for a long time, folks are building AI programs just saying, we're going to adhere to these principles. But how do you do that? Where's the structure? And that's why, we think it's appropriate in today's time to start benchmarking your AI governance program to either the NIST framework or to ISO 42001 or a combination of the two. But we think benchmarking to these emerging standards is how you take your governance program to the next level. Andrew, I know as you were sitting in-house and as you've been advising clients as part of our AI team, building a governance program is everyone's in agreement. Let's do it. But we see a lot of common pain points. And this sort of is generating the why of why you should benchmark to standards. But these are some of the common pain points we're starting to see.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that really sets us apart is, unlike privacy, where, a compelling event like the GDPR or something like that gave us sort of a North Star and let's, follow that, or let's follow California. We know we can't wait and see, and yet we don't have sort of the center to what it is that we're doing. And that lack of center also extends to the people that are carrying out this work. And you sort of already spoke to this leadership issue earlier, but I think when you look at this decision-making bottleneck point that's on the slide, part of the challenge here is that we really did see a lot of privacy lawyers kind of repurposed. And if you look at the IAPP, which is the large trade association for privacy lawyers, they said, more than 50% of their members who responded to their survey anyway, were finding that they had responsibility for AI, and many of them in leadership roles. But this is very much a multidisciplinary project that often involves legal, but it often involves IT, security, a whole bunch of different engineers, ethics and compliance professionals. And it does muddy the waters if there isn't a decision-making structure that's in place, and then there aren't objectives about the governance of these tools and how they fit into the value creation for the company. And that's something that the standards actually do quite well. And these standards can be compatible with existing structures within the company, so it reduces waste and coming up with new ideas when you can sort of extend existing ones.
Yeah, and I think this this issue of decision-making bottlenecking and unclear regulatory picture is really generating a lot of interest in benchmarking to the standards. The decision-making bottlenecking, what I've been seeing is you have a group, an AI committee being stood up, a singular committee being asked to review all AI use cases and give a thumbs up, give a thumbs down, give advice to the business. But what's happening is some of those committees are being asked to make strategic decisions. Is this the type of AI we should be deploying? Or does this align with our ethical framework? Does this align with our mission statement? But if they're an operations team made up of the privacy attorney, the IT team, and HR, they may say, that's not our call to make. We need C-suite involvement. We need the board to give us direction. The reverse is happening as well, which is decision makers, strategic decision makers, the C-suite is being asked to make operational decisions. Does this deployment of AI present a privacy or cyber or an IP risk? But that's not really their role either. They don't want to be making that decision. So you see this bottleneck because people are pointing the finger saying, I don't know who's making what decision. I think separating up the decision-making, bifurcating it is the way to go. You need to have a strategic team reviewing whether the use case makes sense, and you need to have an operations team determining how you roll out. And that'll allow you to roll out high reward, low risk use cases quickly. And it'll allow you, I think, to mitigate the risk around high reward, high risk use cases where you need significant guardrails. And the unclear regulatory picture, this snapshot here comes from a survey that we ran last year, at the end of last year, across the UK and the Middle East, and asking companies about what's restricting them on deploying AI. And unclear regulatory environment was a predominant feature. So what does that all mean? That all means these emerging standards are important and that they're being used to benchmark. Now, we've got a lot that are out there. We've got the NIST AI risk management framework. The EU AI Act is its own form of a framework, I guess you could say, because it has ethical principles. It has steps you can take for high risk use cases. You have OECD principles. We have the ISO standard now. We also have IEEE standards and a bunch of technical standards from ISO and IEEE that sort of supplement, I think, some of these emerging frameworks. So we're gonna break down for you the NIST framework and the ISO framework, and then what we think you can do to implement or benchmark your program to these standards. I'll start first with the NIST framework. This is one that most folks are probably familiar with, at least on some level. NIST, for those who aren't familiar, is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is a branch of the Department of Commerce. And NIST traditionally has issued technical guidance and standards for the federal government. Probably most famously, they released the cybersecurity framework in 2014, which has been updated, that many organizations use as a benchmark for cybersecurity controls. They have a privacy framework that many organizations use. And so this NIST AI risk management framework was released in January of 2023. And it is informal, voluntary guidance for how to set up a framework to manage and govern AI risk. And so tradition, or I guess I would say consistent with traditional NIST fashion, it's got a core around the risk management framework, which is mapping your risk in your use cases, measuring what tolerance you have for risk, managing that through guardrails, and then governing the entire process as an iterative process. And so NIST has multiple controls under each of these categories that you can apply. They've released supplemental materials about what are unique risks to generative AI. I would say one thing to think about is, will the NIST AI risk management framework become industry standard in the US for commercial dealings? Will you expect your vendors to be aligned with the NIST framework as your benchmark reasonable? Will the Attorney General of California say that baseline reasonableness in California is alignment with the NIST framework? I think these are all open questions, but we have seen that approach with the NIST cybersecurity framework. We've seen attorney generals, courts say, well, if you're aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework, that's baseline reasonable from a negligence standpoint. So I think that still remains to be seen. Another important feature of the NIST framework is that it is very much focused on the ethical principles and the ethical framework, and also the socio-technical impact of AI, how it impacts the broader society from a human, from a labor, from an environmental perspective. They bring that concept in. So it's a much broader, I think, viewpoint around AI risk than perhaps the ISO standard, which is much more sort of technical in its operation. It highlights human in the loop as a key component, and it still is sort of going through iterations. Now, NIST has been the victim of a lot of Doge cuts. So we're still sort of waiting to see how this framework evolves in the sort of agentic era, but it's a very important framework. There's a lot to it, but it is something that you can benchmark your program today. Another program to benchmark today, Andrew, that I know you're uniquely qualified to talk about, because I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are a certified ISO auditor, which is—
Yeah, I'm a lead auditor. Yeah.
Lead auditor, which I feel like should be on your signature line for your email. But maybe you can walk us through the ISO standard and then kind of how it differentiates with NIST.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the differences you'll see right away is that because NIST came out first and 42001 came out a year ago, sometimes just being first matters in terms of your level of attention and adoption. I think another thing that we see that separates these two is that NIST is free and ISO costs money. An ISO standard is put together by an international organization. The I in ISO is international. And a copy for an individual is about $250. And so for some companies, that's already, a bit of friction. But there are different rates for teams, et cetera, and you can scale that up. One of the things that I think about when I think about, which is appropriate or whether you might want to use both, is to know about other risk management standards that are used and adopted by your organization. Worldwide, the 27001 certification that you often will see in, vendor agreements and otherwise, there are 65,000 companies that have that. And that base, that risk management base that is at the beginning, the clauses of that standard is very compatible with the 42001 approach. In fact, it's, very, very much using a lot of the same words and order and concepts. So you've got a 65,000 company install base, I guess you could say, for the security team using these concepts. There's around 2,000 companies using the 27701, which is the privacy version of that. And then you only get to about 50 when it comes to 42001 at the moment. You might ask, well, why? How come only 50? Well, part of that is because we're about to hit an important point, which is the standard that allows you to audit against 42001 is in draft, or it's actually in like pending publication form at the moment. But once it is published, you should see a huge push by the consulting companies and others to go out and audit against this. And until then, there's sort of a little bit less activity going on. But I should mention that this integrated approach, which ISO calls an integrated management system when you use multiple standards, is encouraged by the standard itself. So you see 27001, for instance, mentioned 7 times within the text. So it's very much designed to be part of a larger structure. I would warn you, if you're reading this for the first time, let's say you purchase your copy, a lot of people like to skip to the end, which is not how you read a book, and it's not how you should read a standard. The clauses come first for a reason. So the clauses are there to define really the hard work of setting up the program, defining the objectives of the organization, the leadership, the funding. What are we even doing here? And it's only when you get to Annex A that they bring in the controls and you realize, okay, there are 38 controls across 9 domains. Here's what we're going to do with those. So I don't know why, but every time people love to get to the controls, part of it could just be the security people love the controls, right? It's the tangible thing that you know what to do with. But don't skip to it. The themes are leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and continuous improvement. And that last one, continuous improvement, is something that really comes up a lot within the risk management of AI. You cannot build it and then walk away. To all the use cases we were speaking about, you look at that trough of disillusionment and all the changes that are going to happen. This is a program that's going to remain highly active throughout the time that you're running it. In terms of how to get started, I can give you some of the basics, but I can't get too deep with the time that we have. But define your governance system and goals. You need to assess your organization's readiness and think about the objectives and scope, and secure your leadership commitment. And I do want to flag scope for a moment. So I think even if you just want to know, when looking at someone else's program, what it is that they're certified to, it's important to look at that statement of applicability that comes with these certifications and say, what scope have they assigned? It could be 2 offices, it could be all their offices across the world, it could be 1 product or service, it could be every product or service. And so really just knowing that is incredibly important to evaluate the effectiveness of the program and whether what they've done is applicable to you. And conversely, if this is you setting it up, you should think about whether you need it to apply to everything or specific areas of your company and specific implementations need to be addressed. So, build from there, get that governance structure in place, implement the controls. You can go to the appendix now, and conduct those risk assessments, because the risk assessment under ISO, anyone that wants to get into that, I'm happy to talk about that at another time. There's an aspect of this that's risk, there's an aspect of this that looks at impact. They're compatible but separate, and it's very difficult to get into the technical aspects, the inaccuracies, the issues like that, and the ethical and the societal impacts like discrimination. And so you move forward with that, you train your teams, you prepare for certification, hopefully you get it, and you move forward continuously improving.
Yeah, Andrew, one question that came up in the chat. So
Okay.
the ISO standard itself is released, but the
Yes.
auditing standards for how you audit against it is soon to be released. And so
Yes.
we're anticipating that when those audit standards are released, there's going to be a lot of companies saying, okay, now's the time to get ISO 42001 certified. Because you can, that's the main difference between ISO and NIST. You can get certified against ISO. There is no certification against NIST.
Yeah, when you were saying alignment to something, that is not as robust as a third party came in and checked to see if it was true.
Right.
And so when you think about contracts and what you want to hold people to, you want to think about that as well. Really, if you were going to go out and you said, you know, Andrew, what should I buy as a suite of standards to implement this properly? I would say 42001, but I'd say 42005 because it addresses impact assessments. I'd say 42006 because those are the requirements for the audit that are in draft form, but in weeks will be available as final. And then 23,894 would be the risk management guidance that I think underpins a lot of this.
Yeah, one other one point that you raised earlier about scoping, which I think is really important, is that for ISO certification, you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to certify the whole company. You can certify individual systems. So, you know, if you have built, you know, if your HR department is using AI extensively, you could certify your HR department's use of AI through a limited management system. I think that's a really important sort of takeaway from an ISO perspective versus NIST, which is much more holistic in terms of reviewing the risk management. So I think some key opportunities here. One is, Andrew, you mentioned it with ISO, which is in the clauses, but management involvement, strategic decision-making, understanding your scope, where you sit in the market and where you want to head with the technology as it advances into more agentic solutions, I think is critical right now. You've got to map where you are in the ecosystem. And one of those mapping things is that, and ISO calls for this. It's interesting when you read the ISO standard, it's a small line in the beginning that says, before you put in place your controls, you want to map your external and your internal risks or impacts to the AI system. And external is everything from your legal obligations to contractual obligations. Internal is your ethics framework, your strategic alignment. So there's a lot that's baked into the scoping, to your point. And there's a lot of time and effort that I think if you do it right, the rest of it can fall into place. But that scoping and that mapping exercise is really critical. And it's at that point you can, I think, build contracting playbooks, build methods to monitor state developments, understand where you sit in that broader legal ecosystem. I think, Andrew, this is your point here, walk before you run on ISO 42001 certification, because it's not something you can just do sort of overnight. It's sort of, I think of it like SOC 2 compliance in cybersecurity. You're going to bring in a third party to audit yourself. You've got to carefully sort of map how you're going to scope that audit and what systems are going to be in scope. And I think that's the same way to think about 42001. And one thing, Andrew, you mentioned earlier, maybe you did, or I heard you mention it, was aligning yourself with existing, how the security department views standards to get budget. Maybe you could talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that 65,000 company install base, and yeah, the implication here is, you know, privacy, AI, some of these other departments don't always have, you know, the immediate ability to get budget, but security often has figured out the best way to make these asks. And the way that they make those asks is something that you really should discover and embrace. So if work is being done to make you know, budget measurements and requests under NIST, I would make those requests for your AI committee work under NIST. And that is a perfectly fine approach and a successful one in my experience. For the 42001 standard, if you have 27,001 in place, you're going to be able to leverage a huge amount of existing work around, you know, risk management and and really be off and running. And so you should be able to convince your peers more readily that this is a lower lift for a great benefit. So definitely, reach out to others, both from a budgetary point of view, but also make sure that your work is going to be compatible with existing efforts that have already been put together. Because as we said earlier, this is really the work of a committee, regardless of who leads it, whether it's, lawyers today and other technologists in the future. It does require key contributions from multiple parties, and you're going to need to convince each other that this endeavor is possible and worthwhile.
And with that, Andrew, we're up on time. We hope this has been useful. Alexa, we'll turn it back over to you, but I would say last point is iterate and innovate. If you haven't dusted off your AI governance program and policies recently, now is the time to do it as the technology is sort of moving into the next phase. And of course, if you have any questions or want to talk offline, Andrew and I are always available. So back to you, Alexa. Thanks, everybody.
No, thank you. Very helpful. I now have another to-do list on go back to our policy and just go through the checklist. So really appreciate this. Everybody, the materials are going to be available on the website because I'm pretty sure I was taking screenshots of them that we're going to refer to them. So hope to have you guys again soon. Thanks.
Thanks all.